It would be presumptuous of me to introduce to you Jane Van Lawick Goodall. You all know her, and you all know her work, which is now over 10 years old, a long, intensive, extensive study of chimpanzees in their natural habitat, with particular reference to the Gombe Stream Reserve in northwestern Tanzania. The nature of that work has been made available to all the world through her extraordinarily successful and beautifully written books, to many, many people all over through her lectures. And this morning we have her with us again to tell you about the chimpanzee portrait of the best-known ape. Jane?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Howell. And good morning, everyone here. It's a great privilege to me to be taking part in this second symposium in memoriam of Dr. L.S.B. Leakey. And I also had the privilege of taking part in that first symposium last year, when Louis himself should have been with us to do that symposium. So I wanted to start off by saying that I feel this is a great tribute to Louis. This is a larger gathering of people than it was last year, and the concept of the symposium itself is larger. And I think this, in a way, can be compared to the kind of effect which a truly great man can have on the world. It's kind of like concentric circles rippling outwards as more and more people are affected by the thinking of that particular person. And I think without doubt, Louis was a very great man. He's influenced many of us here. Many of us here wouldn't be here but for him. And whilst his contributions in the scientific world, the positive contributions, will never be forgotten, the point I wanted to make was that I feel something which may be in danger of being forgotten is what a very far-sighted man he was. He began work at Olduvai, as you heard yesterday from Mary Leakey, very early in the 30s, and he persisted there in the face of a lot of disbelief from his colleagues that these pebble tools weren't really part of the culture of early man, and he persisted for more than 30 years, and finally this persistence was rewarded with the first hominid discoveries at Olduvai. And back in 1957, when I first met him, he was talking about the exciting possibility of doing excavations at Lake Rudolph. And then in the other sphere in which he's made such a great impact, the study of the non-human primates, he again was ahead of his times, and he initiated studies of the gorillas in the 1950s, and I met the girl to whom he offered the chance of studying chimps sometime quite early in the 50s, and luckily for me, she turned it down. So I just wanted at the start to acknowledge my own indebtedness to Louis for what he did for me and to what I think he's done for so many of us who are here today. Now, Louis wanted studies of the great apes done because he felt understanding their behavior would be significant to the understanding of human behavior, because they're our closest living relatives, the closest thing we have today to the Stone Age men that Louis devoted so much of his life to discovering about. And Dr. Hamburg, too, who's going to be talking after me, he was interested way back early in the 50s in trying to find out about the chimpanzee for the same reason. And it turns out the chimp is a remarkably close relative of ours in biochemically, anatomically, and as many of you are aware, very close behavioral similarities in some aspects of chimpanzees and man. One of the aspects that I want to bring forward today is something which I consider to have been one of the most significant findings resulting from the long-term nature of the work at Gombe. Started in 1960, now in its 13th year, and we've now found, because of this, that the chimpanzee does have a truly remarkable period of childhood. Compared with most of the other non-human primates, this period has been extended, and it covers a much greater percentage of the lifespan, the entire lifespan of the animal, than it does in creatures like monkeys and baboons, and even, it seems, gorillas. The chimpanzee does not start to leave his mother for any considerable periods of time until he's about 8 or 9 years of age. And that is a long period of childhood when you consider that a baboon is mature and can start to have infants when she's 5 or 6 years of age. The chimpanzee female, on the other hand, doesn't start to reproduce in the wild until she's 13 or 14 years of age. And we're talking with a chimp of a lifespan of something like 40 to 50 years. We're not quite sure how long yet they can live in the wild. I wanted to start off this morning by showing you a few slides running through some of the stages of this long period of dependency of the chimpanzee child on his mother. And before we see the first slide, let me just remind you about the chimpanzee community. You see, it's not the kind of community that Diane Fossey talked about yesterday with the gorillas. It's not the kind of troop that we're used to thinking of in terms of baboons, where a certain number of animals move around in a spatially compact way for many years, even though these groupings of baboons are not totally socially closed. Nevertheless, 30 or 40 animals do stay together over many years. In the chimpanzee, we have a different situation where approximately 40 animals live together in a community, but within this community, which as a whole has rather a large home range of about 20, 30 square miles, within this, the chimpanzees move around in small temporary associations. In the community, some individuals know each other extremely well and associate and travel around together frequently. Other chimpanzees in the community meet up only seldom when, for instance, some particular tree is ripe and has a good fruit crop, or when there's a sexually attractive female forming a focal point for the gathering of relatively unfamiliar individuals. It turns out from the long-term study that those animals who tend to associate very frequently and repeatedly over time are very often related through the family. They may be sibling groupings or mothers and elder offspring. If we could now have the first group of slides. This is just to give you a picture of the habitat at Gombe on the eastern shores of Lake Tanganyika. This is the furthest east that the chimpanzee range extends, and the chimpanzees we're studying are the long-haired, the eastern variety. Gives you some idea of the habitat. Much less inclement than Diane Fossey's gorilla habitat, where she has had to cope with much harder physical difficulties than ever we have in studying the chimps. Now here we have the one and only chimpanzee unit that is stable over time, a mother and her dependent young. And in this slide, the old female Flo, whom many of you are familiar with, is seen with 3 of her youngsters. Fifi, here aged about 6, Flint, aged about 6 months, and Figan, a young adolescent male, round about 10. Now, he is not a permanent part of this group. He's reached the age where occasionally he'll leave his mother and wander off, very often joining adult males. But after a while of traveling in this way, he'll return and continue to move about with his mother. Sometimes 2 mother groups, such as you just saw, will join up together and travel about for a while, for a few hours or a few days, before separating up again. Sometimes a mother group, and here is again the old female Flo, with her daughter Fifi, her older mature son Fabian, will join up with other temporary associations of adults, in this case 3 mature males. Note Flo's younger adolescent son Figan keeping a peripheral position on this group. That's very typical of adolescent behavior, which Dr. Hamburg's going to be talking about later. Sometimes a mother group will join up into a larger association, such as that I mentioned, in this case to feed on the shoots of this tree, which happens to be a very favored food. So there is Flo and some of her family joined up with a few adult males and some females for that purpose. This group may remain together for a while, but then the different individuals will separate off and go their own ways. Now we come on to infancy. This again is Flo. This is her 5th known offspring, the infant Flame, who was born in 1968. And it illustrates a 1-day-old baby and how an experienced mother will adopt a secure cradling position for her infant in whatever posture she herself happens to be in. The chimpanzee infant can cling from birth, some much more readily than others, but most mothers give a newborn baby support with hand or with bent thigh for the first few weeks of its life. Not all the time, but every time, presumably, that the mother feels the hands or feet of the infant slipping from her hair. Nursing. The infant is very often groomed while it nurses. A slightly older mother still cradling her, a slightly older infant still being cradled by the mother. When the child is about 5 months old, it begins to ride in the dorsal position. This, in the wild, is normally initiated by the mother. At a certain point in the life history of the infant, the mother starts to push it up onto her back when she's ready to travel. It takes a couple of months before the infant can ride securely in that position, but by the time he's about 7 months old, he's quite experienced. This is what we call the jockey position. And by the time he's over a year, he may be quite blasé. The chimpanzee infant doesn't normally start to take his first tottering steps on the ground until he's 6 months old. This is in marked contrast with a baby baboon who starts to totter in this way when he's as young as 2 weeks old. This is 6 months, sometimes even older, and the infant is likely to maintain a very tottery gait until he's well over a year. At about the same time as the baby learns to walk, he begins to start climbing in the trees, using the small branches, keeping very close to his mother, as you see here. And in these early days of the infant's life, it is the responsibility of the mother, almost entirely, to maintain contact between herself and her infant, to protect her infant from any dangers of the environment, whether they be social or something to do with the trees and other things that he's investigating. If he climbs too high up in a tree and the branches begin to bend, the mother may notice this before the infant himself is aware of any possible danger of falling, and then she'll reach up, as you see Flo doing here, with a slight worried pout of her lips and rescue him. Chimpanzee mothers typically share food with their growing infants, and indeed, unlike the other non-human primates, this is a tray which is extended into adult life. The mother continues to share food with her juvenile and even her adolescent offspring, and food sharing between males is common. The first social interactions which occupy any considerable percentage of the infant's time away from its mother and with other individuals of his community are typically in gentle play with other youngsters. And here we see Flint, who's now aged about 9–10 months, playing with a juvenile female. And these older animals normally play very gently with small infants. At about 9 months of age, the patterns of social grooming, which is such a very significant kind of behavior in the social life of the non-human primates, begins. Initially, the infant makes very clumsy movements like you saw with Diane's gorillas yesterday, but by the time they're about 18 months, the grooming pattern is pretty well developed, although the attention span of the infant is quite small and his grooming sessions are seldom longer than a few minutes until he's about 4. Initially, the interactions of an infant with other females tend to be rather brief because very often females are apprehensive, it seems, of the effect that their contact with an infant will have on the infant's mother. Therefore, if you have another female who is subordinate to the mother of the infant, she may appear cautious in her contacts with the infant, as you see this old female Ollie here. However, the adult males show no such apprehension when an infant approaches, and as Flint, here he's about 11 months, he's approaching the adult male Hugo, who's reaching out, the typical kind of response of the adult male to the approach of an infant, reaches for Flint and takes him into an embrace. And as you can see, the mother is not worried about this. She's just sitting there quite calmly. The adult males are extremely tolerant of the approaches of infants. Here you could see a 3-year-old begging from an adult male. One of the situations which really points to the tolerance of the adult male to the infant is during copulations, when we've seen as many as 3 infants rush at an adult male and push up against him while he's copulating. And normally the most he does is kind of turn his head away from them and look as though he's trying to pretend to ignore them. However, in spite of this tolerance, there are some rather nervous females, such as Ollie, the adult female here, who appear to be apprehensive of their youngster making too many approaches to groups of adult males. And in this particular situation, which is at the feeding area at Gombe, the 4-year-old daughter of Ollie had been repeatedly approaching one or other of the adult males you see here, trying to play with them, pirouetting around. They had made no signs of aggressive response that I could see, but the mother Ollie became increasingly apprehensive, and finally she went up and took Gilka away and sat holding her firmly by the hand. As the youngster grows older, he does show more submission, more caution in his interaction with the adult males. And here you see a 3-year-old showing the typical submissive presenting to one of the adult males. Play becomes rougher, wilder, rough and tumble play forms a larger percentage of the total time of social play by the time the youngster's 4 and 5 years of age. This is Flint, aged 4, sort of cartwheeling over the juvenile he's playing with. The infant chimp is very sexually precocious. He may show his first interest in estrus females when he's as young as 9 months. And by the time he's 2, as Flint is here, he's showing an almost completely typical mating pattern for the adolescent male. And to end up this sequence, the youngster continues to share a nest with his mother, usually until the birth of the next sibling, which doesn't usually happen until he's about 5 years of age. And as we'll see later, some youngsters continue to share a nest with the mother for even longer. Infants continue to nurse for anything between 4 and 6 years, with the average coming somewhere in the middle. Typically, nursing goes on for about 5 years. So that gives you some idea of the ways in which this long period of development can be observed in the field. I wanted to briefly mention the typical maternal characteristics that we see in wild chimpanzee mothers. And these are of almost unlimited patience, tolerance, gentleness, and behaviors which we can collectively call affectionate, grooming the child and playing with it. There are very few rejections in the early years of infancy from the mother, and very few pain-eliciting stimuli. If the mother does want to prevent the child from doing something, she tends much more towards activities which serve to distract the child. She may groom it or play with it, than she does to actually punish it. And here again, the chimpanzee mother differs quite markedly from some monkey mothers, such as baboons, who tend to be much more aggressive towards their youngsters during infancy. Because of all this, perhaps, a very strong bond between the mother and her child develops. And maybe this helps to serve to keep the infant close beside his mother during these early years of his development. And let's ask ourselves why this is significant. Why has evolution produced a species in which the period of dependency on the mother is so long, in which for each individual chimpanzee who's produced, the female puts out such a large amount of maternal energy, as it were? And I think it's probably fair to say that this is significant for the chimpanzee, just as it is for man in relation to social learning. The young chimp does have a good deal to learn about the different individuals of his nomadic community, about the different foods to eat, about the tool using and hunting techniques of his community. And maybe he needs a long childhood in order to learn these things. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about the different ways in which young primates can learn and do learn during the early formative years of their life in the wild. Now, of course, all animals, to some extent, have behavior which is genetically coded. And this is extremely obvious if we go to creatures at the lower end of the evolutionary scale, like amoebas, some of the insects. Most of their behavior is pre-programmed. They can grow up in isolation and carry on a life as a perfectly normal adult, a life which will not differ from an insect which has just been left to live out its life normally in the wild. But as we come up through the evolutionary scale, we find an increasing complexity of brain and a corresponding increasing complexity of behavior. And it seems that social learning and learning through experience come to play an ever more important role in the development of the organism. Primates are born with tendencies to behave in certain ways. And these tendencies, as it were, become molded as they grow up, living a normal life in the kind of society which has played a role in the evolution of the species itself. Isolation-raised chimps, little chimps raised for 2 years without contact with human beings or other chimps, when they are released from this isolation, do show patterns of behavior which seem fairly typical of some of the gestures of the species, such as the reaching out and begging gesture, social grooming, things like this. But, and this is important, although they may appear, they appear in wrong contexts. And there's a great deal that the young chimp has to learn about how and when to use some of these patterns, which we can probably fairly safely label as species-specific patterns. So let's briefly examine the kinds of learning which do in fact go on at Gombe when a young chimp is growing up. For one thing, there's direct experience with the environment. The young chimp in this way learns what food tastes nice and what doesn't. He learns what branches are likely to break under his weight and which ones are supple and will hold him. A whole variety of things, you can think of a great many, which he learns simply by experimenting on his own with the world around him. But then there's a second great category of ways of learning in which his behavior is, in one way or another, molded by the individuals of his society. He also learns through direct observation of the other individuals of his society. Now, initially, his behavior is molded to a large extent by his mother. When he's a tiny infant crawling about on the ground beside her and she's ready to go, she reaches out, picks him up, and clamps him to her ventrally. And it's very easy for him to understand that signal. He's got no choice, in fact. But as he grows older, he learns to respond to mere gestures signifying the same kind of thing. When he's 9 months, instead of taking hold of him and putting him ventral, the mother just reaches out and taps him. And he responds to that by approaching and clinging on ventrally. When he's older still, she may just reach towards him. And so it goes on until by the time he's 2 and 3 years of old, all that may be necessary is for the mother to get up, take a couple of steps, and stand looking back towards her infant. And he is by that time able to understand that she's ready to leave, get up, and follow her. Now, he learns in the same kind of way through interactions with the other individuals as he grows older. He may approach an adult male to play and the male may respond by playing. But on other occasions, he may do the same kind of thing when the adult male is feeling aggressive, has his hair out, may be about to perform a charging display, so that the infant must learn to understand, as it were, what is the mood of the other individuals in his community. And some patterns are rewarded and other patterns are punished. And in a way we can compare this to the disciplining of a pre-verbal child, a pre-verbal human child, who learns through interactions with other grown-up people or siblings in the household the normal patterns of behavior that are expected of him in a typical culture in which he grows up. Now, there's some behavior in animals which is socially contagious. Social facilitation, it's sometimes called by ethologists. And an example of this, the young chimp may be traveling along a trail, and suddenly there'll be a little sound of alarm from one chimp, and the whole group may turn and flee. Subsequently, they may go back to investigate whatever it was that caused the flight. It may have been a leopard, the scent or smell of a leopard. And the youngster in that way is able to learn through the responses of the other individuals of the community what are the dangers of his environment. And it's obviously a much better way for him to learn than to learn through his own direct experience with a leopard, an experience which he might not survive in order to profit from. Then there is some behavior which serves to attract the attention of the developing youngster to certain aspects of his environment. For instance, when the youngster travels with his mother time and again along certain trails through the forests, his attention is drawn towards the physical characteristics of the preferred travel routes of his mother. And when he's old enough to travel independently, he very often follows the same paths as his mother led him along as he was a child. So he's learnt indirectly through his close association with her in early years. And then finally, we come to a very major category of learning, which is through direct observation of the other individuals in his community. Now, it's been shown experimentally in laboratories that primates are indeed capable of observing through direct observation of another individual. For instance, if you have a rhesus monkey in a cage from which he can see another rhesus monkey who's being offered discrimination problems, then the first monkey, when he is presented with those same problems, shows that he has indeed profited from observing the performance of the other monkey in the other cage. And this kind of thing appears to go on very frequently in the wild. It's very hard to prove it conclusively, but it seems fairly evident that it goes on. For instance, you very frequently see young chimpanzees watching closely the behavior of their elders. And this particularly applies to things such as tool using or the displays of the adult males, the nest-making techniques of the adults, the ways in which certain foods are eaten. All these things the youngsters watch carefully and may then themselves try to imitate. Initially, they may do it clumsily and with little success, but as they grow older and continue to watch and imitate, so with practice the behavior becomes more polished, and eventually the youngster attains the kind of skills that you find in the adult. We have a few examples which seem to point rather more clearly to cases of imitation. For instance, a young 4-year-old went off with his mother on what we call a safari. Sometimes the adult females in estrus go off with one particular adult male who may lead them to distant parts of the range away from other chimps. And in this case, the 4-year-old Atlas went off with his mother with the adult male Fabian, who's lost the use of one arm through some kind of paralysis, which is probably polio. Now, because of this paralyzed arm, Fabian cannot use it to scratch this arm. And so if he has an itch on that arm, he'll typically rub his arm against a tree. And this is something we haven't seen the other chimps doing. Well, when Atlas, the little 4-year-old, came back from that safari, he was rubbing his arm on a tree, just as Fabian did. Another example was a female, a mother, feeding on a hard-shelled fruit, which, if eaten when unripe, is very bitter and often induces the chimpanzees to salivate quite considerably. And this mother was sitting there eating the fruit, and there were long strings of saliva coming from her mouth. And her 2-year-old infant was seen watching her carefully and then making little dribbles and sucking them up and dribbling and sucking them up. And the infant hadn't eaten any of that fruit at all. So those kind of things do point to the ability in the wild chimp of true imitation. Now, it's probably important to the evolution of new patterns of behavior to realize that in the young chimpanzee and the young primate in general, newly acquired manipulative patterns or patterns of any kind are less rigid than they are in the adult. They're more flexible. They're more likely to appear in novel contexts. And this seems to be because once the youngster has mastered a new manipulative pattern, such as tool using, he rather enjoys practicing it. And we saw Flint when he was 10 months old, 2 years old. He'd just mastered the art of fishing for termites by poking a twig down into a hole. And he was constantly practicing this, even when the family was nowhere near a termite nest. And he'd pick a little twig and termite in the hair of his sister's thigh, or in some other inappropriate way. The chimpanzees crumple up leaves in their mouths to make them more absorbent and use these as homemade sponges to dip into hollows in tree trunks where water's collected that they can't reach with their lips. And I've seen a 2-year-old infant making a minute sponge of this type to dab at a patch of sticky fruit on a tree. It wasn't a very appropriate context, but it was a novel one for the use of that particular tool. Chimpanzees use twigs to investigate things which they don't, for some reason, want to touch. Maybe they're apprehensive of it. And we saw 2 different youngsters use twigs in the same kind of way to inspect the genital area of female chimps. Now, there was no use for using a twig in that context. They just touched the lips of the vulva and sniffed. But it was a novel context. And I think it's important to realize that these kinds of things can happen and sometimes may be extremely significant in the evolving culture or tradition of a particular primate group. Very good examples of this kind of thing are found in the work of the Japanese scientists. They studied this group of Japanese monkeys on an island, and a 1-year-old female one day began to wash her sweet potatoes in the sea. They were being fed on the beach. And presently other infants imitated her behavior, and then the mothers of those infants imitated the behavior, and eventually the new tradition spread through the entire group. And it's important also to recognize in this context that there are tremendous differences between individuals. Some individuals are much more gifted than others in this kind of inventive process. In the Japanese monkey group I was talking about, this same female, little Emo, 2 years later invented another pattern. They observers fed them wheat on the sand, and the wheat used to get mixed up with sand. And one day, Emo went over to the sea and dropped her wheat in it. And the wheat floated and the sand dropped, and she gathered up the clean wheat. And this new pattern, too, spread through the entire troop in the same kind of way. We should mention, too, that sometimes these new exploratory tendencies of the infants are curbed by the mothers. We've seen at Gombe an infant feeding on a food that was not listed amongst the food plants of the Gombe chimps, and the mother suddenly noticed, turned round and hit the food away. And George Schaller recorded the same kind of thing in the mountain gorillas. I'd like to end up that discussion of the ways in which young chimpanzees can learn and the kinds of things that they need to learn by saying again how these processes, these learning abilities, which characterize young primates, in the chimpanzees, just as childhood has been extended, so has the learning capability of the young animal been extended. And we find even in adolescence in chimps that the behavior has by no means become fixed and rigid. The young animal is still learning, his behavior is still being modified. It's particularly true of the charging display of the developing male, still changing. And it's true too for the female in her attitude towards infants. And we can say, in addition, that even adult chimps are quite capable of learning. They've shown this in the wild. They've shown it much more, of course, in experimentation in captivity. This is one of the characteristics of man, that the characteristics of childhood are extended into adulthood, and we certainly see the beginnings of this same kind of extension in the chimpanzee as well. Well, having talked for a little while about the adaptive advantage of a long period of dependency, the advantage for the developing youngster to be in constant association with an experienced adult who knows what to do in time of social stress, who knows which foods to go to at different times of year, who knows the best ways to travel through the mountains. Because he's with her, so much of the time she's looking after the daily survival needs of the youngster. he is, as it were, free to devote a great deal of time to play and exploration, things which are undoubtedly very significant in the development of new fashions, new traditions in the group, as well as giving him the opportunity to observe the other animals and to learn the skills that he needs to be an effective adult in the group. But let's look for the last few minutes at the other side of the coin. There are times when it seems that such a close bond between a mother and her child is not adaptive, because when this bond is threatened or disruptive, it can be extremely traumatic for the young chimpanzee child. It's been shown particularly in work in labs by investigators like Harry Harlow, and Dr. Hamburg's going to be talking about this, the effect on an infant monkey of even quite brief separations with his mother. It's very upsetting to the youngster. He becomes anxious and depressed. And we see the same kind of thing in the field. If a chimpanzee accidentally loses his mother, even up to the age of about 6 years, he becomes extremely anxious. He doesn't play anymore. He's whimpering and crying and searching for the mother. And this kind of behavior persists sometimes for as long as a day, whimpering, searching, not playing with other individuals, until he is once again reunited with his mother. Now, if we're looking for situations in the life of a normal, typical young chimp, which might seem to him to threaten this close bond with his mother, we have two different situations which fulfill these criteria. First of all, there's weaning. Now, for some young chimps, weaning does appear to be an extremely traumatic period. The mother is not rejecting violently. That's important to realize. The weaning process is a very, very long one, which starts when the infant is about 3 and is characterized by the mother just occasionally preventing access to the nipple. And by the time the youngster's 4 or 5, she's doing this slightly more frequently, but always gently. She never hits the child away, as you see so often in baboons and other monkeys. She just denies access. And the child may begin to whimper. And as this happens more frequently, he whimpers more. His play activity with other youngsters may drop considerably. He may throw tantrums when his mother denies access to the nipple. He tends to revert to infantile patterns which he's begun to grow out of. Contact with his mother sharply increases the percentage of time he spends in contact with her. He may start to travel around on her back when he's 4 or 5 and being weaned more than he did just before the weaning process began, sort of as it were in earnest, along with the drying up of the mother's milk. And he also may show behavior which looks rather like depression. He'll sit huddled up, and there's a sort of general decrease in his level of activity at this time. It's much, much worse for some young chimps than for others. We don't quite know why, but it seems to be that the more independent a child is at the time when the mother's milk starts to dry up and she starts to prevent access more frequently, the less likely he is to be really upset by the weaning process. However, for those youngsters to whom weaning is very upsetting, it's likely that the depression caused by weaning is likely to continue for as long as a year after the milk's finally dried up and the child really is weaned. And then the next situation, which seems to threaten the infant, is when a new sibling is born. And again, some young chimps go through this without seeming to care at all, and other young chimps again show these same kinds of signs of depression, usually not lasting very long. The third thing that can happen is the abrupt breaking of the bond between child and mother, which occurs when a female dies, when the mother dies. And this can be so traumatic for the developing youngster that in many cases it leads to the death of the child, even when he's able to eat food independently, when he's presumably relying very little on his mother's milk at about the age of 4 or 5. It seems that the psychological impact of the death of his mother, the individual with whom he has established this very close bond, is something which he does not find easy to survive. If we could now have the next lot of slides. Now, I started off with some slides to illustrate the kind of pattern you see during weaning. Fifi, Flo's milk has just dried up, and Fifi is showing that rather huddled posture that typifies these depressive reactions in the chimps. And she's also close to her mother, as you can see. Same kind of thing with another infant, Pom, contact with her mother. And here is a youngster, Merlin. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's about 4 years old. His mother has been dead for some time. He's been adopted by his elder sister, who's traveling around with him, allowing him to sleep with her. But nevertheless, he's become emaciated. He's developed a number of stereotyped behaviors associated more with social deprivation of young chimps in laboratories. He's plucked out a lot of hair, as you can see. He spends long periods of time just lying like this. He's very listless and lethargic. His social responses have deteriorated. He very seldom plays. When another youngster, Flint in this case, comes up to play with him, Merlin either responds by crouching submissively to the ground or by turning and being aggressive. He's just about to bite Flint in this picture. And Merlin only survived his mother's death. Well, not only, he survived his mother's death by 18 months and then finally died. And 2 other orphans who lost their mothers at about the same age as Merlin also died. Now, I'm going to end up with a sequence of slides on one chimpanzee, Flint, and his mother, Flo, who went through all of these processes that I've just been talking about. He became depressed during weaning. You see here he's over 4 years old, crouched on his mother's back. And after Flo's milk dried up during her pregnancy, Flint would sit very close to her. His level of play with other youngsters dropped very considerably. He would spend long periods of time with his lips just touching her nipple, as you see here. And he was also throwing a great many temper tantrums. If Flo didn't allow him to ride on her back, he threw a tantrum. If she didn't share food with him, he threw a tantrum. And then his sibling was born. He was fascinated by the sibling, and for the first couple of months, he stopped riding about on his mother's back and followed as she moved through the forest, but he insisted on continuing to sleep with her. And he would push into a nest with Flo and the new baby, the only youngster we've seen so far to share a nest with his mother after the birth of the next baby. And here, as you can see, his good behavior after the birth of the baby Flame didn't last very long, and soon he was once more riding about on Flo's back, almost all the time when she was traveling, as a matter of fact. And sometimes, if he became extra anxious, he would revert to the even more infantile position. If Flo wasn't ready to move on when Flint was, he would start to whimper, kick her, push her. And if she didn't respond, throw a tantrum. If she did get up to move on, he would jump on her back. And throughout all this time, he was constantly pestering her for social grooming. Every time she sat down to rest, he would whimper and raise an arm or turn his side to her, soliciting social grooming. And typically, Flo responded. Well, unfortunately, Flo's new infant Flame only lived for 6 months. She died when Flo herself was very ill. We never knew what became of the body. Flint was there at the time. And after Flame's death, Flint became much more active. He played more with the other young chimps. But he did become, it seemed, even more dependent on his mother. He continued to ride about on her back. He continued to sleep with her at night. He's now about 6 years old, traveled with her all the time. And it seemed that Flo was more physiologically and psychologically geared to looking after a small baby, and therefore that she accepted Flint back in place of her lost infant, rather as the gorilla mother, Old Goat, that Diane was talking about yesterday, took back Tiger as her infant after the intervening infant had died. Flo's daughter, Fifi, had her first infant when Flint was about 7.5 years old. Flint was still traveling around with Flo, who then became the first known chimpanzee grandmother. You see her there looking over her daughter's shoulder. And Fifi traveled around very often with her mother and with Uncle Flint. There they are, traveling along together. And Flint, 7.5 years old, still riding on his mother's back quite often, still nearly always sleeping with her at night. Now, it was last year that Flo, who'd looked pretty old since I first knew her in 1962, began to show extreme signs of age. At a rough guess, she was between 40 and 50 and closer to 50, but we don't know that for sure. But at any rate, her behavior slowed down. She became very emaciated and began to travel increasingly by herself without even Fifi. She was slowed down too much for Fifi. And the only youngster with her, the only chimpanzee with her a lot at that time was Flint. And he was still pestering her for grooming all the time, as you see here. And we used to sometimes feel quite annoyed with him because she needed to rest so badly. But in retrospect, when we looked back, we realized that without Flint, Flo's old age would have been extremely lonely indeed. And it was last September that we found Flo's body lying in the stream. We have no idea if there was anything other than old age that caused her death. Probably not. Flint was with her at the time, and repeatedly during the first day he went down to investigate the dead body. And on the morning of the second day, he'd begun to show these signs of depression, quite extreme actually, huddled and remaining close beside the body. He made a few visits to the feeding area, briefly interacted with other chimps during those first few days, but always after a short period would turn and hurry back to the place of his mother's death. On the 5th day, he was no longer staying right beside the body. We moved the body, but he never went back to that particular place. But he was spending most of his time within an area of about 50 square yards from the place where Flo had died in the stream. And for a while he would make a few excursions away, traveling with other chimps. He spent 2 nights away from that area in the first week, significantly perhaps, on both occasions traveling with his elder brother Figan. He began to stop eating. He no longer played with the other youngsters when he did meet them. He lost a large percentage of his body weight, became extremely listless and lethargic, spent long periods of time just lying on the ground. We hoped that when he met Fifi on the 5th day, that she would be able to offer him some comfort, and indeed he did seem to relax when he was with her. But although Fifi repeatedly waited for him when she moved on, Flint, it seemed, was too lethargic to follow. And he began to spend more and more of his time lying, as you see him here, with his eyes glazed, simply not moving. And we did try to help Flint. We tried to stimulate him, we tried to feed him, but nothing that we could do helped. His whole organism became weakened through lack of food, and maybe, if you like, something like the lack of a will to live. He did get some kind of gastric enteritis, it turned out from post-mortem, which undoubtedly hastened his end. But Flint only lived for 3 weeks from the time his mother died. And although it was a great tragedy when he died, it does point to the significance of this bond between the mother and child. It does show us a little bit the kind of devastating effect that it can have on a youngster when he loses his mother. And I think it's important. Well, let's set the slides off. I think it does tell us quite clearly the depth to which the affectionate bond between a chimpanzee child and the mother can go, and it does point again to a similarity between man and chimpanzee. You see, although Flint may have been unusually dependent, his mother unusually old, we have other youngsters who are still just about as dependent on their mothers at age 7 and 8 as Flint was. So we do have the beginning of this tremendously deep bond of affection between individual animals, exemplified here in chimp society. And I simply wanted to end up with 1 or 2 comments. The value, I think, of field studies, primate field studies, is that it enables us to collect information on a variety of different primate species in the natural habitat. And it shows us a gradual trend, if we go from the primitive Gallego through the monkey to the great apes, to increasing complexity of brain and behavior. And the chimpanzee, of course, comes high up on this evolutionary ladder. It helps us to understand something about the biological evolution of some of our own patterns of behavior, something which Dr. Hamburg is going to be talking to you about next. It helps us to understand something about the evolution of behaviors like aggression, which may have been significant and adaptive to our own Stone Age ancestors, but which are much less adaptive in modern man, as Dr. Hamburg will be saying. Now, it's equally true that observations of mother-child relationships in non-human primates point to the importance for the developing primate of a strong bond with his mother. And the significance to the youngster is very clearly brought home by stories such as that of Flint, by understanding something of the problems the youngster may go through at the time, such as weaning. Other primate studies, which we don't have time to go into, point to the tremendous significance for the developing primate of the first few years of experience. And the same kind of thing is being shown with preschool children, a tremendous importance for social learning and other kinds of experience in those early formative years for the adequate development of the organism into a functioning adult. Because you see, we are primates too, as we all know, that's why we're all here. And as scientists look more and more closely into our own human behavior, we find more and more parallels between man and his close relatives, the non-human primates. For instance, work by Bowlby and Spitz and others points to the fact that in the human child too, this relationship with his mother is of tremendous significance. And if it's interfered with too much, it produces disturbances which may continue into adult life and may indeed prevent the adequate functioning of the mature human being. And I think it's true to say, and this is what I want to end up with, that there are a number of maternal patterns in our own species which have been shaped through evolution to meet the needs of our own developing youngsters. Things like social play with a baby, a good deal of physical contact with a baby, maybe things like eye-to-eye contact during breastfeeding. These have gradually evolved along with our own species. And if we can take account of the non-human primate studies, where we know that these kind of things are very significant if you want a normal adult non-human primate, then they may be very significant for our own developing children as well.